Thanks for coming and joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about how to evaluate a published genealogy. And there are genealogies all over the place, which we'll talk about. But what makes a genealogy credible and accurate? And moreover, what makes it a masterpiece? And there are some. I want to try to answer those questions today. Hopefully you will come away with a better way of evaluating the family histories that you encounter and maybe get some ideas for writing one of your own. Published genealogies are derivative rather than original sources, secondary rather than primary. This means that they are removed from the original sources of information and represent interpretations of original records by a genealogist. They can vary greatly in scholarship and quality. Some are considered what are called quote unquote authored works, which is a genealogy that is a special category that is fully documented from a variety of different sources, and it's rare to find in book form, though there are some. They're more likely to be found in journal articles in scholarly journals. So that's the highest category of genealogies that are out there. Informed researchers should have some tools to evaluate a genealogy effectively, not only for the sake of their own research, but as a guidance in writing their own family histories. Most experienced genealogists know that even if a published genealogy contains wrong information, it may still lead us to better, more accurate sources. And that's true of books as well as the genealogy we find online. It is estimated that in the 1990s, there were more than 100,000 genealogies that had been compiled for North American families. That number has likely tripled since the 1990s, and maybe even more than that. And when you consider online sources, such as the family trees we see on Ancestry and on Family Search, and ones we just find randomly on websites if we Google them, there are probably millions of genealogies that exist in some form online. The Allen County Public Library's collection of published genealogies numbers around 70,000. If you think about the scope, coverage, and geographical range of all the published genealogies, the amount of information is staggering. Genealogist Corey Meyerink estimated that the average published genealogy book contains references to about 1,300 people. By his calculation, and this was him calculating in the 1990s, some 115 million names have appeared in genealogies in the family history library at that time. Thus, there's a very good chance that somewhere out there, whether it's online or in a book or in a journal article, there is some research that's been done on a family that you're researching, especially if they've been around in North America for a little while. So, and whether the information you find is accurate or not, that's a different question, but you could find something out there that pertains to a family that you're working on. For the purposes of this lecture, I will be using the terms genealogy and family history interchangeably. Some genealogists make a distinction between the two terms. Genealogies, they argue, contain only names and dates showing vertical arrangements of generations, while family histories, on the other hand, seek to put these names and dates into a larger historical context, creating biographies of each subject, assembling evidence, and putting the whole story of the family together in greater perspective. These can be arranged in genealogy format, even with the biographical information, or they can be like chapter by chapter histories of a family that really aren't genealogies at all, but they're books that tell the story of a family. So they can come in lots of shapes and sizes and forms. One of the first steps then to determine whether a genealogy is a good genealogy is to determine whether one even exists at all of interest to you. With the ease of internet searching now, Google and Internet Archive have lots of genealogies that are available online. We have an Internet Archive station here at the library that's digitizing books that have been published before 1930. And so many older genealogies have now been digitized and are easy to find online and fully searchable. The Family History Library also has a station here at the library, and they're digitizing many books as well. Again, there's that copyright situation that they're dealing with, but many books from the 20th century and earlier are available online now, and you can see those. WorldCat is a catalog that's associated with OCLC, which is a catalog that covers the holdings of a select number of large libraries from around the world, and they will list holdings of books. They don't have the full text of the book online, but you can see whether they have a particular book in their collection. We're part of OCLC, so our collection is discoverable on there. And this is a free source you can use online to go into this catalog and see what's out there that may be in a library. There could be some library in a place like in the South or somewhere that has a one copy of a family history that's only in that library and nowhere else, and it may show up there and not anywhere else. So it's a good place to look for things that can be quite obscure. There are other well-known genealogical collections that are not on WorldCat, however, and you have to search those directly with those collections. And then there are also published bibliographies that have been done of genealogies. They've gotten sort of out of date now because of so much that has been digitized and so much that's online that few people use these bibliographies anymore, but I'm going to mention them anyway as we go through this. So here's what WorldCat looks like. I did a search on, I know this particular family history is one of my own ancestral families, and a man named John Hayes of Dover, New Hampshire. And it was a book that was published in 1936. It's a pretty good genealogy. It's 2 volumes, and we have it. So our holdings show up on OCLC or in the WorldCat catalog as being one of the partners. But there are other libraries, there's 56 other libraries, according to this other record, that have it. And then below that, there's yet another listing for it on microfilm of other libraries that have it. So it's a way of looking to see where this might be. This is an old slide, so it maybe there's many more places that have this available now. It's a way of finding and discovering where a particular genealogy might be located. One of the older published bibliographies was done by someone named Marion Kamenkow. It was done in the 1970s. It's called Genealogies in the Library of Congress, and she went through and identified all of the published genealogies that were there in that collection. Then she published supplements in 1977 and 1986. So again, these are really old books, very much out of date, but it still might be useful for looking for something. I would suspect just about every book you can find in here you would find on WorldCat, but it might still be worth looking at. There's a complement book she did called Complement to Genealogies in the Library of Congress, and she came to St. Louis, Denver, Los Angeles, New York City, and here in Fort Wayne, and included the books at that time that were in our collection and did a supplementary biography. The DAR published a catalog of its library in the 1990s. Again, that's out of date now because they now have it all on their website. But these bibliographies still can be useful. There might be something in them that would maybe be hard to find on a search online. There are a number of them on microfilm and microfiche. We have a collection here called UMI's Genealogy and Local History series that has lots of microfiche of family histories. Many of these, I suspect, are now online, and you can find them on Internet Archive and on Family Search. But just in case you don't, this is another place to look where some of these might be available in microfiche form. We don't get many users of microfiche anymore, and this collection is hardly ever used, but it does exist, and it does give the OCLC catalog number for the item. So I suppose the first criteria then to look at would be format. Is the book published? Is it printed or microfilmed or digitized in some way? Or is it a manuscript? It could be that someone wrote a genealogy, never published it, and it is wound up in an archive somewhere as a typescript or as a handwritten manuscript. It's available and may not be digitized at all. It may be buried in some collection. There could be an online digital version of it or on a website, which we all know, all of us have Googled things and found all kinds of genealogies that are online. Or it could be in a journal, a published journal. And journals can vary greatly in format and style. Some are considered quote unquote scholarly, which means they have a high degree of threshold for accepting an article. They're peer reviewed by experts before they're allowed to be published, and everything is carefully checked. And there are a few of those journals we'll talk about in a minute that are like that. Then there are a lot of other journals that are not peer-reviewed journals. The earliest American genealogy credited as being published was called The Genealogy of the Family of Mr. Samuel Stebbins and Mrs. Hannah Stebbins, his wife, from 1707 to 1771. a book published in 1771, before the Revolutionary War, in Hartford, Connecticut. And we have a copy of it in our collection. From the 1770s to 1832, only about 12 other genealogies were published in the whole United States. Think of it. After the Civil War entered the so-called Gilded Age, local and family histories were published in increasingly large numbers, many for older New England and Mid-Atlantic families. Paper was cheap and access to printing was more affordable. And so a lot of people who were making money in the sort of big industrial boom after the Civil War found it in their interest to have a family history written. Either they wrote it themselves or they hired someone to write a family history. We know that by 1900, there were about 2,700 genealogies that had been published in the United States, probably many more in England, but I'm looking here at the US. Here's an example of one, the Wentworth Genealogy, American and English, published in 1876. It's a 3-volume work, and it's still widely regarded as an excellent genealogy, even though it doesn't quite meet all of the modern standards of documentation. The author included a lot of original documents and put them as transcripts in the book, and it has a great index. So it's regarded as a pretty good book, even if it's not, even though it's quite old now. Unfortunately, there were some works that are considered to be of little value because they were found either to be unreliable or because of faulty conclusions drawn from the authors. And this is one of them, published in 1898 by John Dorland, called Records of the Dorland Family in America. The author was well-meaning, but an untrained genealogist, and he did not understand Dutch naming customs, particularly the customs of patronymics. So he made a number of critical errors that have been recently corrected in a new volume that's since come out of them. Errors continued to plague many genealogies of the 20th century when several thousand more appeared in print. In fairness, many of these works were never intended for scholarly study. They were written for pleasure. Their authors were untrained but well-meaning genealogists, and their books were intended only for private family distribution, not for the scrutiny of today's online multimedia genealogy savvy world. Some genealogies go beyond the realm of innocent mistakes, however, and have been shown to be excessively prone to error and even fraudulent. Several authors have become notorious in this regard, and their works should always be regarded with extreme caution whenever they are encountered. One of these writers was a man named Gustave Anjou, who is considered the worst of the worst and is now widely regarded to be a genealogy charlatan. Careful research by modern scholars has shown that much of Anjou's life was fraudulent, and many research reports that he compiled on various families available on microfilm or digitally at the Family History Library should be used with extreme caution. He was born Gustav Ludwig Lundberg in Sweden in 1863. He immigrated to the United States in 1890. Once in New York, he changed his name to that of his wife's maiden name, Anjou. He claimed a PhD degree, which he did not have, and after producing a reasonably reliable index of probate records of Ulster County, New York, he began offering his services as a genealogist to wealthy clients. For a large fee, Anjou turned out works on a large number of colonial New England and New York families, only a few of which were actually published. Many others were prepared only in typescript form and were intended for private distribution. According to the late genealogist Robert Charles Anderson, there are several hallmarks of Anjou's works that should alert the reader to the possibility of fraud. They include, number one, a dazzling array of connections among many immigrant families to New England, which go far beyond the published pedigrees found in other sources. Two, many wild geographical leaps that go well beyond what are considered normal migration patterns. Three, a large number of citations to documents that actually do exist with many accurate notations. And four, a select number of fraudulent or invented documents that appear in the text without citation, but which appear to prove the family connections claimed. Anjou designed them intentionally to confuse and mislead the reader into accepting the work as a whole. Here's an example of his report on the Fordyce family, which is considered spurious. Note that he gives exact dates of birth, marriage, and death from as early as the 1500s in Ireland, when there are very few records extant in Ireland from that time period. That's a red flag. Beginning in the 1930s, a greater degree of professionalism in genealogical research and writing led to the transformation of the field. Accuracy and documentation were seen as being important. Genealogists such as Donald Lyons Jacobus, Walter Goodwin Davis, and Mary Lovering Holman, among others, led this revolution, demanding higher standards for what was considered genealogical proof. They augmented their work with documentation and prepared their conclusions with great care based on what the evidence from primary sources actually indicated. Since the late 20th century, the establishment of the Board for Certification of Genealogists also continues to promote professional genealogy by advocating proof standards and certifying researchers. These are some of the peer-reviewed scholarly journals that I told you about: the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, the Genealogist, the American Genealogist, which hasn't been published regularly in recent years, the Virginia Genealogist, which is now defunct, the New York Genealogical and Biographical Record, and there are a couple of others, the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, the Rhode Island Genealogist, and a couple of others that are considered to be peer-reviewed and scholarly in their contents. They're a good way of identifying a potential article is by going into the periodical source index, which we have on our web page, and looking for it under the surname to see if you find a journal article that's available online, or in a periodical. It may not be online. You may have to go to the periodical, but you can at least search the Percy Index online. With respect to the publishers of genealogy books, there is no similar standard. With the exception of Newbury Street Press, which is a scholarly press under the auspices of the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, most genealogical publishers are vanity presses. That is, the author of a genealogy can compile a book and then pay to have it published. Most genealogical publishers will publish anything so long as the author pays for it. Some of these publishers are well known. They produce well-manufactured books on acid-free paper in quality bindings, and in doing so, they provide an important service to genealogists. Researchers, however, cannot rely on the publisher's name alone to determine whether a particular work is more error-free and reliable than another by the same press. The content is usually only as good as the author who compiled it. Let's turn to the style and arrangement of genealogies, and by these criteria, we will evaluate both the arrangement of the material in a genealogy and how it is supported by evidence. First, let's look at arrangement. Genealogies come in a variety of styles. Some begin with the earliest progenitor in a family and then proceed to trace some or all of his descendants through either male-only lines or a full-scale work of both male and female lines down to a specific generation or point in time. Some may treat only a single ascending or descending lineage with little attention paid to siblings or cousins. Other genealogies might follow what we call an all my ancestors style. The author begins with him or herself or someone else that in the past, maybe a grandmother or a great-grandmother, and then they proceed to tell and show all the ancestors for that person going backwards in time, using sometimes Anantafels or hourglasses. Those are two different styles. The author begins with the person and then goes backwards and shows everybody. Authors have employed a variety of different numbering systems and arrangement schemes to organize their data. Of the descendants of a progenitor variety of a family history, the two forms that are most popular and have gained the widest acceptance are the so-called register system and the NGSQ system. Both of these have become standards in the field. There's no right or wrong one to use. For doing an ascendancy genealogy, where the author begins with himself and works backwards, there is something called the Anantafel or the Sosa Stradonitz approach, which I'll show you those examples in a minute. So here is an example of the register format. This is from Joan Curran's book, Basic Genealogy Numbering Systems, Numbering Your Genealogy. And she shows here how the register system works. In the register system, the first person in the pedigree gets a number 1, and they have a little generation number after that person with a number 1, and they show that if they trace the family overseas to another country like England, they show those with A, B, and C backwards in the time. They don't show them with 1, 2, and 3 because they reserve those numbers for those in this country. Then, when you go to the children of that person, The only children that are assigned a number are those that are carried forward. So in this instance, you see Moses Moss, you see Matthew Moss, born in 1730. He gets a number 2, but Mark and Mary are not traced forwards. And then we see Martha Moss, who is also traced forward, and she gets a number 3. So only the children that are carried forward get assigned a number. The advantage of this is that you don't get a lot of clustered numbers. You can follow the numbering pretty closely. The problem is that you could be right along in a genealogy, and let's say you find some information about Mark Moss, number 2 in that first paragraph there, and you've already done a big amount of work. All of a sudden, Mark needs a number. And so you have to renumber everything. There are programs that will do this for you, genealogy programs, but I'm not a big fan of genealogy programs for writing the finished product of a book, just because the information tends to be stilted and mechanical and doesn't look like a work that's been actually written and carefully curated by an author. You really have to write it, I think, using a Word or Word Perfect or some sort of word processing system, and then use the numbering system that it comes with that. So that's the register system. The the NGS quarterly system, everybody gets a number. Everybody gets a number. And if a line is carried forward, a little plus sign appears before the number. So in this instance, we see here Matthew Moss again. We see the first son, Matthew Moss. He gets a number 2, but he has a plus, and so does Martha Moss. And that helps us know that line is carried down. That way, if you find out that you find more information about another line, you can always add in that information relatively easily without disrupting the whole system. Some people love one system, some people love the other. And as I said, there's no right or wrong way of doing it. But either way, you can run into problems. Let's say you find a new child for a couple and you didn't assign them a number. That can be a problem then for your whole numbering system. Some people have identified other numbering systems, but these are not systems that are widely recommended. One is called the Henry system. And this is from a book called The Handy Family, Annals and Memorials of the Handys and Their Kindred. This was actually written during the Civil War, before a lot of the more current numbering systems were compiled. The original manuscript is at the University of Michigan, but the author then puts a series of numbers in decimal points after the first number, but it's quite confusing to try to go back and figure out who's who in a system like this, because you really can't easily tell who the parents of this person is just by the numbers that are used there. There is a variant for it, but it's difficult. It's difficult to use. Sometimes you'll encounter systems like this. This is from the Waldo family, 1902. Again, the author decided to reinvent the wheel and not use the genealogies that were out there. He decided to use letters indicating people and putting together a system like this. But again, it's very difficult to find and difficult to document, difficult to follow a line backwards in time. So I don't recommend trying such a system if you can avoid it. Sometimes you'll find outline format. This type of format is very popular in England and in Ireland. And if you find an old genealogy from there, you'll often system used where they have an individual and they'll show their children and then another inset showing their children. And there can be multiple insets going down, trying to show children of children of children indented, so to speak, as you go further down. It's not a recommended system either. It can get cumbersome. It can be difficult to assemble all the original nuclear children from the original couple. But that's just one system that you'll sometimes see. Sometimes you'll get to really bizarre systems like this one, the Michael Frank's Family History and Genealogy, published in 2002, where the authors come up with their own rather strange numbering system that's very difficult to document and follow along. They do exist, and we have them in our collection. Or here's another one, the Hannibal Choate Ford Family Genealogy, 8 volumes, and they came up with this very strange system of numbers that's very difficult to follow. Like the parent, I think, is signed 1245-23, and then his children are 1291-51, 52, 53. But again, it's very hard to trace backwards in this line to figure out who's who and who descends from whom. Now, with the All My Ancestors format, there are ways of doing these that are quite effective. And there's a set of these that were published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society in 1992 by Dean Crawford Smith and Lindy Lutz Sanborn, called one is called Ancestry of Emily Jane Angel. And in this book, they did chapters by chapter alphabetically on all the different lines that this lady descended from. And you can see then the first page of what her line is going back to that person. Then they have well-documented genealogies that follow, somewhat indented here, but they follow and they're well-documented, showing the line of a few generations of that line, tying into the lines of the person who goes back to the original person. The Onontoffel format, you'll also see, this is in Gary Boyd Roberts' Ancestry of American Presidents. They'll begin with the president and show his father will be number 2, his mother will be number 3. Then you double the number to find their parents. So Augustine Washington's father is number 4, is Lawrence Washington, his mother is Mildred. And then Mary's Ball's father, double the number to 6, is Joseph Ball and Mrs. Mary Johnson. And then you double the numbers again and go backwards in time. That's a common way of organizing a genealogy that's in this type of format. Again, if you're just tracing the direct ancestors of a person. The Sosa Stradonate system is another system that's out there. It's basically a bare bones collection of names, vital dates, and places. Others are more elaborate, some with biographical information included. This variation goes back by generation, using the same numbering system that we see, but more information is included, showing other children in the generation. Often in larger works, each generation is separated by a new chapter heading. The second criteria is content. That is the evidence that the writer uses in the text to support his or her argument, and it should be a decisive factor in the overall evaluation of our work. A good genealogist presents specific evidence for claims made in the text, which, taken as a whole, compels the reader to accept its validity. You should ask, does the author present a clear and convincing argument in support of the evidence? Does he or she rely on original or derivative sources? If there's a particular fact stated, is it all from the same source, or are there multiple sources presented from different points of origin that go into supporting the same fact? For example, if a person was born on such a date and you find a family Bible for it, you find a vital record in a local record book for it, and then you maybe find a military record with that same birth date, you have then documented that date from 3 different sources that aren't derivative of each other. They all come from some different point of origin. And that's something that's considered valuable. Sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we have people that are so difficult to document that we can't find multiple disparate sources for a piece of information. We have to go with what we find. But if you're doing reasonably exhaustive research and you're looking at all records of a person in a particular place, and you're collecting all the deeds, all the court records, all the vital records, all the census records, all the military records for a particular family, and you're going through and exhaustively looking at all the records that are available, and you compile it into some kind of arrangement, you're generally doing what we consider reasonably exhaustive work. And in that case, when you document all the material that you find, you'll often find you'll have sources from multiple places of origin for a source. So that's one of the things you want to look at when you look at a genealogy. What is the skeleton that underpins the genealogy that you're creating? Good preface is a good place to start out by evaluating a genealogy. And the preface should be a place where the author begins by introducing his or her work to you. And in this place, the author will lay out the methodology he or she used for compiling the book. This is from the Gerald Parsons book, Parsons Family and English Genealogy of Descendants of Cornet Joseph Parsons. And he talks about other books that have been published on this family before. He talks about the problems he encountered in researching it. He talks about what he used as tools to evaluate the sources that he did, and how he came to using the sources that he did to compile the book. So it really tells you the roadmap that the author followed for compiling that book. If the book has no sources and you can't evaluate where the information came from, that doesn't mean we throw the genealogy away and say, oh, it's no value. We want to use every book we can possibly find as clues to our research. So even if you have a genealogy that has no documentation, and there are many of those in our collection, we still recommend you use them and look at them. Just don't give them heavy weight unless you have sources to underpin them. But use them for clues, use them for guides, and make the best of them that you can. That's basically our philosophy here. As we look carefully at the text, we should discern how the author presents the evidence. A good genealogy will gather a variety of facts, as I said, from a myriad of sources: land, court, probate, military, newspaper, church, cemetery, census, and vital record sources. It will rely on more than one original or derivative sources, and it will use all forms of evidence, both original and derivative records. The sum of these sources taken together, what they argue, help us to support the family relationships presented. So in this example, this is from David Kruger's Jonathan Watson of Dover, New Hampshire. The author lays out direct, indirect, and negative evidence for each generation. He had the choice of doing a narrative or paragraph form, but here he simply lists the land records in order and lays them out and documents them. In this case, he's done both footnotes and he's embedded notes in the text for his sources. And some people will do that. You will find that in a lot of older journal articles. A complete document example can also be helpful. For example, let's turn to this page from the Gerald Parsons book, which we looked at a moment ago. Note that he extracts the complete record of a court from 1701/2, transcribes the whole thing. So he allows you, the reader, then to read what he read and allows you to interpret what he interprets. And so you can see there, he didn't just choose a sentence here or a sentence there. He lays the whole thing out for you. And that can be another thing you can do in compiling a genealogy. It can get cumbersome, and I wouldn't do that for every court case that someone is involved in, but there's something important in a court case. It might be useful to transcribe the whole document in the text, and so that the readers can see the whole thing rather than just seeing some paraphrases from it. There should be also a command for understanding and interpreting evidence in a good genealogy. Does the author demonstrate that command in the text? Do they have proof arguments? The use of some historical background shows that the author understands what was going on historically around the time that the family being studied lived. And so having some background in there can be helpful. A good genealogist will place some of the evidence in context. For example, if a large number of children in a family died within a short period of time, there may have been some sort of epidemic that affected their community, and adding that background will give more relevance to the readers. This is an example here from Jane Fletcher Fisk's book, Thomas Cook of Rhode Island, which demonstrates her understanding of probate law in her description of selling of dower rights. Fisk also carefully abstracts the dates of children, even including the day of the week, preserving an aspect in the original town record that exists there. If it's there, that can be helpful. Does the author understand other kinds of terminology from the past and appropriately put it in the text? Take a look at this page from Ron Hill's Tumultuous Achim-Fulford Relationship, with abstracts from Chancery Court proceedings and transcripts of Chancery decrees and orders. This is a book that studies a family in England going back well into the 1400s and 1500s and 1600s. It took a fairly expert eye to be able to look at the records of that time and transcribe them accurately because of the handwriting, and then interpret them accurately. And he did a brilliant job with his book on this particular family. So that's an example of how someone shows a command of knowledge of the types of court records and what the language contains in them and how to interpret them. How does the author treat the subject of family tradition? Tradition is an important part of genealogical research that every researcher will want to encounter. There may be kernels of truth embedded in it, but it should also always be evaluated carefully and identified as tradition whenever you find it, and lay it out in a footnote and in the text to say that it's tradition, and so that the reader knows that they're looking at something that may be false or may be twisted or magnified and not accurate. So in this instance, we see a tradition reference, which is good, but there's no attribution of the source, which is not so good. Many families have the tradition that three brothers came over on a ship from England or Europe. Beware when you hear this kind of story in a family history without supporting evidence. The problem for many families is that when traditions are repeated over and over in many different sources for a period of many years, it can take on the force of fact, even though the facts are not factual, so to speak. Milton Rubinkamp, one of the deans of 20th century genealogy, has stated, quote, "Tradition is a chronic deceiver, and those who put their faith in it are self-deceivers." He adds, "The probability of falsehood in a pedigree increases in geometric ratio as the lineage claimed increases in grandeur." That's also very true. Finding a tradition mentioned in a published genealogy is not in itself wrong. It actually enriches our understanding of the cultural history of the family. It just needs to be carefully identified and documented as such. Who told the tradition? Was it recorded in an interview? If so, when and where? And give us a documentation of when the tradition was collected. How does the author deal with unpleasantness or family skeletons in a published genealogical work? This example comes from an article in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, which illustrates how a genealogist can effectively deal with the problem of bigamy. Undoubtedly, you will encounter many problems when searching your own family. Most families, especially modern families, have illegitimate births or children conceived before their parents' marriage date, if they married at all. Many families have adopted children that are part of the family, although not genetically linked to the forebears being studied. How does the author deal with sensitive topics like this? Acknowledging the humanity of one's ancestors makes them more accessible to us, but treating these subjects can be difficult. Genealogy ethics demand that sensitive information about living people not be published. That information is redacted. Some argue that no birth dates of living people should be published. The ethics are really important. An author can't publish everything without violating ethics. Incest, adoption, crime, when living people will be hurt is something that we have to be taken into consideration. And we can't just put that in a book, or we could be in trouble of something. But it can be valuable to have it. And if enough time has elapsed, it can be published. For example, we may be dealing with DNA, autosomal DNA or Y DNA, that shows that so-and-so isn't the biological father of another so-and-so. And the DNA points to a different direction. And if no one is living involving this, if enough time has elapsed, it can certainly be laid out and told in the genealogy. But if you're dealing with people who are alive and they don't want their information shared, then we have to keep it closed and not share that information. So that's another tool to look at when we're studying a genealogy. Is it logical? Does the evidence, when it's presented, follow a logical progression? Does it appear unbiased? Is there evidence of wishful thinking on the part of the author? These sorts of questions may be difficult to discern at first glance. When an author makes a reference that seems valid, a geographical connection or migration that seems too fanciful to be true, it should trigger an alarm and make us, the user, suspicious. Look at the evidence that the user supports the claim. Many generations are missing in this particular genealogy, and it goes back to people who are fictitious people who lived long before there are records of these people. So there's no accurate information. You can go back to Charlemagne and even Clovis. Getting back before him, there are very few records that are shown. And this book wouldn't be the source that you'd want to use for that. You'd want to use some of the well-documented royal genealogical sources that are out there that we have in our collection that are considered reliable works, and they show each generation and they have documentation for each generation. And for royal genealogy, there are about 60 or 70, maybe 100 people that came into the American colonies who were descended from landed gentry people in England, who you can then trace back into nobility and then into royalty. Those families are all well identified and documented. And if you're descended from one of those, then you can reliably trace it back into royalty. But if you don't have one of those family lines, then you're going to have to really dig into the proof very, very carefully and be cautious and be critical of anything that you find. Use of qualifiers in the text is important. If something isn't proved, if it's a theory, that's okay to present a theory, but it has to be presented as a theory. But we look for words like possibly or perhaps, probably or likely or certainly. These are all convey different levels of certainty. Possibly and perhaps mean there's a remote chance. Probably and likely mean there's some likelihood, but it's not proven. Certainly is still not completely proven, but it is stronger than likelihood and probably. So you look for these in a text. I did a genealogy where we were dealing with a Southern family, and there were certain people in an area that we think could be the children of a particular family, but we couldn't find a document that absolutely established it. So we used probably and possibly in the text after before the child's name in a genealogy. And then we had a discussion, a proof discussion, where we talked about what the evidence was for these people and laid it out very carefully so the reader then knows what we use, what criteria we use to analyze the names of the children in that area. And that then becomes for our readers a chance for them to review our work to see what we use to draw the conclusions that we did. So a good book will try to do that. We'll try to have a proof argument. We'll try to lay out what the evidence was for including the children that they included. Date estimates. Very often you will not find an exact date. You might see the words about or circa. That's drawn from a record which gives an age and a year. For example, a census record. You find someone on the 1850 census, age 30. Well, then they were born about 1820. They could have been born in 1819 and they hadn't turned 30 yet. Or maybe they gave the wrong date, the wrong age. They didn't quite know their age. Say, however, is another term that's used that's based on less specific evidence and more of an approximation. It conveys a sense of vagueness, more vagueness than about or circa. And we use that word when we don't know when someone was born at all. Let's say we have an 1825 marriage license from Virginia, and the person died before the 1850 census. So we don't have an exact date of birth for that person. We can guess that the man was maybe 25 years old at the time of his marriage. So he was born, say, 1800. But we can't say circa 1800 because we really don't have any information about what the man's age was at a given time. We only know that he was about marriageable age when he got married. So these dates are what we want to use as qualifiers when we look at a genealogy. So here's a hypothetical example from the 1850 census. This is not an actual family. There's no relationship stated. We have a John Doe, 48, a Jane, 46, and a Matthew born in Indiana, age 15. We don't know, for example, that John Doe and Jane Doe are husband and wife. They could be brothers and sisters. Maybe Matthew was a child that Jane had before her marriage. We just don't know for sure who this is. We can suppose that there are some genealogical connections here, but we would want to look for other types of records to support our theory. We'd want to find a will or a probate record of John Doe. We'd want to find out if there was a newspaper obituary for them or a church record or some other record that would help us establish the relationships that we're finding here. We might want to look at multiple census records over time. And by the time they got to the 1880 census, they laid out relationships. So that could be helpful. Conflicting evidence. We want to look at things that can exist without when we find something that contradicts itself in the records. The genealogical proof standard requires that all conflicts of records be resolved when reaching a conclusion and writing a proof argument. When conflicts are found, and inevitably they are, if we really do exhaustive research, the conflicts should be clearly set forth, exposing the conflicts, and state exactly how the evidence differs. How is it resolved by the author? Are there convincing proof arguments that explain that? If an age or birthplace varies from one census to the next, other records such as death certificates and cemetery records should be studied. If there are more than one person of the same name in the same area, the book should lay out to show how they can be distinguished. So in this book, this is one of the masterpiece genealogies by Jane Thompson Starr called the Burling Books, Ancestors and Descendants of Edward and Grace Burling Quakers. She talks about the number of people named Samuel living in the same area, and she lays out the evidence for whether this Samuel is one of the people that she's found in these records. And so by laying out the evidence, she's giving us a proof argument, showing us the arguments that she used to help distinguish one from the other. That's a mark of a good genealogy. They're not afraid of laying out the evidence if it's contradictory and showing you, the author, what the records show. It doesn't just say so and so married so and had so and so. They present evidence. Here's another example of documentation. This is an example of, or here's another example of a conflicting genealogy. This is from the Pratt genealogy and from the Buckingham genealogy. This was published as an example in a book many years ago, and you can see that these are two different books that I've spliced together here for the same family. But in one place it's on the Pratt family, and she married Nathan Buckingham, and they had these children. And then in another genealogy for the Buckingham family, they show him getting married to Mary Pratt, showing different children, slightly different from those that appear in the other one. And so we have to try to reconcile these two different records. The author, we don't really know where the author got this information. They may have written to the family, they may have looked at some public records, but we don't know because there's no documentation. But there is a conflicting list of children there. We do see a Joseph, we see Mary Jane, we see Almus, we see Frederick, we see a William F. We don't see Charles. So we have to figure out what exactly is going on here, why there's discrepancies in these books. And that's why we have to go to other documents, like probate records and deeds and church records if they exist, and vital records if they exist, to see what we can do to resolve the situation. Let us turn to the third criteria, which is documentation, which I've been harping on all the way along, which really is the skeleton of the genealogy that underpins it. The second part of the genealogical proof standard holds that a genealogical work should contain complete, accurate source citations to the source or sources of each information, contributing directly, indirectly, or negatively to answers about identity, relationship, event, or situation. Any new genealogy or family history of quality contains documentation in the form of footnotes or endnotes, which can appear either at the bottom of the page or at the back of the book. This allows the user then to follow along with the arguments that the author is presenting in the text. Older genealogies and many new ones don't follow this standard. As a general rule, older genealogies are less well documented. While there may be no footnotes, they may still have quotations or references from original documents, which we can sometimes trace back to their source. An undocumented genealogy, even if it is substantially correct, presents difficulties for the researcher. It is not without value, but without references, the researcher can't follow the work or the reasoning of the author. Readers will have to look further to find direct evidence to support the claims of the author. Having sources just adds weight and credibility to any genealogical work, but they can still be wrong. Whether the author's conclusions are right or wrong, citing the evidence for those conclusions allows the researcher to retrace the steps that the author took. Don't dismiss it out of hand if it doesn't have sources. Use it for clues because it can still be valuable to you. Here is an example from a classic genealogy published by Donald Lyons Jacobus, who is considered the father of modern American genealogy. It's called the Buckley genealogy, published in 1933, and it's hailed as a masterpiece, even though his documentation doesn't measure up to modern standards. He was the first genealogist to really take documentation seriously in an age when there were lots of frauds and phonies compiling genealogies. He took it seriously and worked hard at documenting the sources that he found. So even though he doesn't have a footnote for that will of Sarah Wilson there, he at least he cites some specific information about it, which gives us some clues where we could probably find that record if we wanted to do it. So there are books out there that are available to you that will help you cite evidence, and it can get rather complicated and even intimidating, but it's useful to read and understand. This book, the new fourth edition called Evidence Explained, is an excellent source that has a great first chapter on the whole process of writing and documentation and how to cite a genealogy. And it's a great background read. I highly recommend reading the first chapter alone in it because it's a tour de force, I think, on how to evaluate a genealogy. Most published genealogies you will consult, even those of excellence, will use a shorter, more abbreviated version of footnotes than those advocated by Mrs. Mills. For example, in many New England genealogies of excellent quality, such as this award-winning one by Jane Fisk, the authors use abbreviated footnotes like DeVere Allen, Prudence Island Allens, no page, no publisher. And that really doesn't hold muster today. You'd want to have a full citation with the publisher and the page where that information was found. But even some of these older genealogies, or some of them that are heavily documented, will sometimes look and use ways of abbreviating some footnotes because the space is pricey. It can add pages and pages to a genealogy, make it more expensive to publish, but it's still useful to have those citations if you can find them and use them. I would still be cautious and wary when you see something that's not fully documented. Do the facts agree with the conclusions? In a broader sense, the source should always agree with the fact it's cited to support. When evaluating a genealogy, look for evidence of whether the notes match the record. Be wary of overstatements in the text or claims that seem to be wild or preposterous. Good genealogists today will qualify their statements if they are not certain or if there are multiple interpretations of a primary source, and they will lay out the con as well as the pro in making a genealogy argument. This is especially true in instances of making an argument based on indirect evidence where there is no single reference that proves the statement, but the collection of related sources builds the case for its acceptance. Good genealogies being written today will carefully break down evidence and support each piece of evidence with a footnote rather than let paragraphs of information pass by with only a single footnote at the end with a series of unsupported statements. There is an art to good annotating, but sources are absolutely critical to the work being well received and accepted. Finally, indexing. Let's look at this fourth criteria. Does the work have an index at all? You'll be surprised that many genealogies, older ones especially, do not have indexes. The problem of that has been alleviated somewhat by their being digitized on places like Internet Archive, where you can go through and then do a keyword search and find information that way. But many of these older genealogies didn't have indexes. You had to go through page by page to look. If it does have an index, is the index reliable? Does it reference page numbers or family numbers? Are women traced both by their maiden names or their married names? Are people of the same name distinguished by birth year and generation number? So if you have a number of John Smiths, do you just have a page of John Smiths, even though they're different people, or do you try to break them down and distinguish them? The one born in 1864, the one born in 1870, maybe showing their father with that in parentheses so that you and the indexer, as you're going through it, know which one is which in the index. That's the mark of a good genealogy. Are there indexes to place names in it? Then the overall layout of the book is also nice to see. And let's go beyond that, because there are the nuts and bolts and of the research are very important, but the artistic elements are nice as well. A well-written, well-crafted, and well-documented genealogical study, the attention all paid to these important parts: arrangement, design, content, documentation, and indexing are all critical parts. And if they're done well, it can become a thing of beauty and aesthetically pleasing design. It exhibits the sense of fine craftsmanship in the same way that a fine piece of furniture or sculpture is reflective of craftsmanship. The design of the book, the cover, the illustrations, the typeface, the paper stock are all elements to consider. In the Genealogy Center's collection, we have many beautifully published genealogies that may have unreliable information, but they're handsome and beautifully done. This one I really like, and I look at it often, as called Just the Story of American Family, written in 1969 by Stephen Barnwell, which discusses the Barnwells of South Carolina. But it's well done. He was a history professor, and it was a family that had a huge number of portraits, and so it's a beautiful book just to go through it, to see how beautifully laid out it is with the illustrations. Hatch and Brood of Time. This is one that came out in the 1990s. It was published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society. This was an award winner, and he did a lovely job, again, with portraits and with stories and with documentation in this one. The Jacobus Award is an award given each year by the American Society of Genealogists. They can see it on their website, the ones that have won each year, and these are all considered excellent genealogies. You can look at them. We have all of them in our collection here, so you can come and look at them as examples of what works that are well done. This is one that's especially fine. I think that was an award winner back in the 1990s. There are books out there, and you have in your handout a list not only of quality genealogies, but also lists of books about how to write a genealogy and books on how to master genealogical proof and how to master genealogical standards and so forth. So I recommend you use those and study those as part of your background in interpreting genealogies. So use everything you can for evidence. Study all the genealogies you can for clues, even if they turn out to be wrong, because even though a wrong genealogy or a riddled genealogy can still have some elements in it that are helpful. There may be sources that the author turned to that were given orally by a family that knew information. And even though it's a tradition, that tradition may turn out to be important. So we want to look at everything. We don't want to be snobs and turn things down. We want to look at every source we can. If you decide to write your own genealogy, you can use the skills you develop in evaluating a genealogy to write a better book. So I encourage all of you to do that. Thank you. I'm here to answer questions.
We do have some questions for you, so let's go ahead and get started. How would you determine the accuracy of a manuscript if there's no reference to supporting documentation?
Well, I think you want to look, whenever you have a manuscript, you want to look for other manuscripts too, that to see if the same people occur elsewhere in other records, and you can verify or put some of the statements into context, because no manuscript usually stands alone. Sometimes it can, and sometimes it is for some places. And in which case, you really have a very hard time to evaluate it. But if you can find other supporting documents that support the information that's described in a manuscript, then that's helpful. Put it in as much context as you can. Trace the people that are mentioned in other types of sources.
There's another question of, do you know if Leonardo Andrea was a legitimate researcher?
You're thinking of Gustave Anjou. That was his name of the guy. And he was a complete crook who set up shop trying to prey on wealthy families in New England and New York. And some people got angry at him and discovered the information that was fraudulent and tried to sue him. And there's evidence of his actions. So I don't know how much evidence that he did that was wrong. I mean, I wrote an article about a family in England, and it was a family, the last name was Letton. And for years and years, there was the published last name of a woman that didn't show up in any of the English records. And it turned out that some very distant cousin of mine hired a genealogist in England, and this was back maybe in the early 20th century. And the guy put some accurate dates in there, but he made up information on some of these other families, and it was absolutely fraudulent. So I went back through the records and did the job that the guy should have done to begin with, and published an article about it with the correct names. So, but there were people out there that were preying on people and lazy and inventing stuff, and it just happens. And it happened a lot in the early 20th century when people were not professionally trained as genealogists. So you have to be careful of that particular era. There were some good people who were doing quality work, but there were a lot of charlatans.
Are you familiar with the Natchez Trace collection that was held at the Center for American Studies at the University of Austin, or of
I
Texas
know
in
of it. I'm not an
Austin?
expert on it. I have not done research in it, but I know of it.
Okay, perfect. Are you familiar with Colonel Lemuel Abbott? He published a book on his ancestors. I found some of it in a library in Massachusetts back in 2018.
I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know if he's an accurate genealogist. You just have to try to track whatever he writes and see if you can corroborate it in another source, and that's can sometimes be hard to do. But be careful of wild speculations and exact dates of things. If a whole genealogy has exact dates in it and there's no abouts in there, you know that's probably invented, because it's unlikely you're going to find exact dates for everything. That's a red flag.
So apparently there in South Carolina, the man is Leonardo Andrea, and
Oh,
I
I don't know
took,
him.
yeah, I did a quick search, um, and some people are saying some of the information is false. So I think that's one that people are going to need to uh, do their due diligence on.
Yeah, I don't know him. But yeah, if people are out there critical of him, then beware, be careful.
And that's the thing. If you find a collection like that, do some Google searches and see if there's any claims. So you put the person's name in quotations, and then you put different search terms like genealogist and accurate or false, and put those words in and see if there's any articles that are written to talk about whether or not their work is good. Because people write about it when they find falsehoods.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have right now. We have a lot of thank yous. So thank you, John, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I truly appreciate the time you take to join us and hope to see you back on Thursday. Bye, everybody.